Hi, my name is Connor Leahy, and I'm going to be speaking about the effects of land use policies and political drivers on the effect of on the price of housing in California. In 2017, Governor Newsom promised that he would build 3.5 million new homes. This is to address a historic shortage in the supply of housing in California. This supply, combined with record demand, is driving up the price of housing and creating inequitable costs for millions of Californians and unaffordable housing for millions more, and leading to a series of negative economic effects and externalities, some of which are pictured here in Figure 1: lost consumer consumption and increased state spending on services like homelessness. Now, this study looks at land use policies and how they affect the development of housing in California, mostly because these things are changeable. So the state has enacted a flurry of bills, created a new task force, new programs, and they're starting to do good work. You can see on this figure on the far right of it, or far left of it, that they've started to outpace production versus population growth, but we are still far behind the governor's lofty goal. So the question remains, what else can we do? I went ahead and took the residential land use data, a survey conducted by the Turner Center for Housing Innovation, so big thanks to them for producing this report, and compared it to demand side control data and housing price data from the American Community Survey, which is from the Census Bureau. I compared these using a hedonic price regression, which is based in statistical software. And all of the data was, of course, publicly available. So special thank you to those organizations as a resource. Prior to digging into the hard data science, I went ahead and conducted a literature review on variables related to the information that was collected in the residential land use survey. So first was NIMBYism. What is it? How does it affect the production of housing and the people who are involved within it? NIMBYism, of course, is an acronym for not in my backyard, or people who are against development generally. I also looked at the effect of impact fee exaction prices on the price of housing. Impact fees are essentially what they are named. They exist because a developer wants to build a house. Let's say it's on a road that needs to get cut down. That is an economic impact. You have to pay for that impact. More importantly, in California, they've become very popular in the last 30 years as an extra source of local revenue, and they're therefore one of the highest in the country here. That cost is always passed down directly to the consumer. And finally, I looked at zoning regulations. How stringent and loose they are can affect the rate at which housing is produced and developed, and therefore affect the supply of housing. You can see on the right, and here's a better look at left, a better look at it. This is just the process you have to follow to widen a curb to turn a single family home into a multifamily lot in the county of Los Angeles. And right here, this says, did you talk to Gary? And I don't know who Gary is, but he's super important apparently. Here you can see all of my explanatory variables, sort of. I'm sure the people online can see it better. But all of these were taken, and I went ahead and compared each one individually as a concept collected utilizing the survey data that were Likert source response or Likert scale responses that I transformed into yes or no comparable data formats. Basically, what they say is what they explain. And I compared them individually to the median price of housing, and then controlled for the size of a jurisdiction, both square mileage wise and the size of the population. At the beginning of this study, there were more demand side variables used. However, due to problems with multicollinearity, which just means too many things are related to one another, it messed up the results, and we're left with 36 individual hedonic regression analyses, which result in 16 statistically significant variables. The percent effect on the right or on the left shows a positive, meaning it increases the price of housing, or lowers it, negative at the bottom. And some of these are what you'd expect. Developable land supply prevents can increase the price of housing because it's a constraint. If you're annexing land to build more residential development, you're building new development, supply goes up, price goes down. But some of these were surprising results, and I'm going to get into that right now. So NIMBYism as a political expression exists for a completely rational reason. Homeowners buy a home. It is their asset. They want to see it go up. Building new housing reduces the price of their asset. And so for better and often for worse, especially for a lot of people in this room, they prevent new housing from being developed. This drives up the price of houses. And this political determination or political expression is a primary deterrent to housing development. Second, there is a one-to-one relationship with the supply of developable land as an indicator of median housing price. So if there's a lot of land to build off of, you'll build more and the price of housing will go down. And the inverse is true when you restrict the supply of developable land. Finally, these interesting factors are hard to suss out, so I'm going to get into them really quick. There's a negative correlation with impact fees as a constraint to development. What this might mean is that lower income areas in California, places with lower housing prices already, say that this is a constraint for them and they feel it the most, which is why the regression analysis turned it up that way. Or some research suggests impact fees, when they're used correctly and exacted correctly, redound to the benefit and of a locality. They're spent well on building out infrastructure, which increases the rate of development later on. The density bonus and inclusionary housing policies are incentives, so the lack thereof, which is what these variables measure, should not reduce the price of housing. This may be indicative of the fact that these policies are not that effective and that places that are working to increase the rate of housing development don't utilize them, but places that want to appear like they are do. Further research is needed to suss out what do we do there. Finally, solutions, political engagement about the effects of NIMBYism and reduced rates of housing development is super important, in my opinion, at least, to trying to get people on board with seeing a future of California that's more economically viable for all of us. Of course, you can't make people feel anything, so increase state enforcement in regards to taking factors away that allow NIMBYs to prevent housing from being developed as necessary. Both of these things are already happening through the state, though I think they could do more. Finally, I think we could, especially depending on the actual result of those impact fees, we could go ahead and spend more money to lower income localities so that they don't need to build their local funding off of impact fee exactions, and make it easier for developers to develop housing without having to pass those costs on to consumers. And finally, anything we can do to increase the supply of developable land is a necessary and incredibly important thing to do. The very clear one-to-one relationship suggests that anything we can do to increase the supply of developable land will increase the rate of housing production and bring housing prices down, which are down to the benefit of all, well, non-homeowning Californians, but I would argue that the positive effects outweigh their negative short-term benefit or loss. Data-informed policies and the political will to enact them are key to fixing any public policy problem. And I think looking at policies like these can help us try and meet the housing shortage gap in California. Thank you. Special thanks to Carolina Reed and the Turner Center staff, who were super awesome and gave me the stuff for free, and Robert Wassemer, my professor, who revamped all of my data for me in like a weekend, and my super supportive cohort and family and friends. Thank you all so much.
Really informative presentation. I appreciate your insights. I'm curious if you've come across in your research or in your data analysis, the impact that local control has on housing, specifically like counties and cities prioritizing single family homes for wealthier migrants to a community as opposed to multifamily homes.
So there were certain factors that in the analysis would have produced that had there been statistical significance. This study suffers from a pretty low N, so that might be the problem. Could also be there just isn't. But one of the things you're talking about is the size of like housing developments. So the more control there is, like for instance, that variable right there suggests there hasn't been a large development approved recently, meaning that the price of housing goes up by around 15% for localities. So, I mean, it's a pretty general one-to-one. A lot of what you'd expect is available here. Also, the unfortunate part about data science is that you don't always find what you want to tell people. Like, for instance, build more multifamily housing, but you should, so.
Connor, interesting stuff. So thank you very much. It probably won't surprise you that I'm particularly interested in some of the political stuff.
Yes.
How did you measure public opposition to housing?
Okay, so every single, the way this data was created is a survey was released to localities and jurisdictions, specifically cities and census designated places. There were 571 in California at the time. They received a response rate of about 275 to 73. And those were local experts and local city representatives answering every question they could. There were certain problems with the N, which lowered them even further than that. Partly, I couldn't line up all the data, but the other part of the problem is that some people didn't have the time, energy, or know-how to answer the questions correctly, so they were just left unresponsive. When you account for the N's, it comes down to the opinion of local representatives or experts, which I'm sure have a political tilt sometimes, but like any public sector research data we can utilize, it's only human. But experts and representatives answered these questions and said, I live in this area and public opposition makes it impossible to develop housing. And when you look at that, there's a 66% increase in the median price of housing based on those factors. Now,
I was also going to ask about the data set, but I'm curious, were there variables that you wish were included, or what data was not available that you would have wanted in your study?
So I think the Turner Center's write-up about their original report and the survey conducted does a really good job of explaining how their report was probably the most robust at the time and California specific in regards to land use policies. And I think it comes from like some of the foremost experts in housing. So I think they did a really robust job. The problem is that not every question was answered, and not every question is completely safe from the political bend of saying something about your populace as a representative of that area and having it readily available for any grad student to find online. So I think it is what it is. I think the thing that I missed most is that there were like so many questions, and Rob and I had to work to find the ones that were answered the most times to actually have a workable end. There are so many people who answered like 30 of the questions, but then didn't answer like 78 more of them. And it's just like, this isn't a usable jurisdiction for a long-term comparison because I only have a couple questions from them. So there was a lot missing that I wish I could have sussed out just in the survey they conducted.
Just really quickly, was a survey anonymous or was it?
I mean, it was anonymous in that it has a date stamp and the city that you're responding about next to. Not really. No, I mean, if you wanted to get someone in trouble, which I'm sure a lot of people who have enough free time to worry about whether there's housing being built in their region do, that you could have.
Hey, Connor. Do you mind just going to your solutions, the
Yep.
finding solution slide? So when I look at this, right, political engagement, state enforcement, distribution of housing dollars, et cetera.
Yeah.
These are not in some sense new.
No.
So right, we've tried them and still we have a housing supply gap and the prices are high and so forth. So is there anything that comes out from your analysis that could help me understand sort of how we could do some of this differently from the way that we're doing it, because I'm sort of, political engagement. We've been trying that for decades at this point.
Yeah. No, I think two things come to mind. One is my research specifically shows that there are a few very heavily like championed common housing policies that seem to have the opposite effect. Meaning that when you look at things like the density bonus ordinance, inclusionary housing being like something that is encouraged or required, or in this phrase, the opposite of, it means it's not enforced. When those things are there in this research, it shows that the price of housing goes down, which suggests, maybe based upon further research, that there are certain things we're doing that are actually making it harder to develop more housing. We're hurting it by using the wrong policies. Why that is might be administrative overlay. They might not be as large of an incentive as possible. Maybe the incentives are offered to people through a very laborious process, which means people just avoid going for them at all. And two, I think this just does add to the discourse about the public opposition stuff. I do think it's really important to hammer that home over and over and over. If you don't want the price of your house to go down, that's great. But if you want your kids to own a home one day, you're going to give it to them, because you're not getting more housing developed for them to live in an economy that will allow them to buy it on their own accord. And to add a third one, I think the thing that, not a lot of this is super exciting or super new, but it is super important in that, like, the last thing that was heavily shown through the data research here is that there is a literal one-to-one relationship between the supplied developable land and price of housing, causal mechanism being new housing being built in those regions. And I think a lot of places say that we can't do any more. Some of those are zoning requirements. Some of those are a lack of innovation. Other places say we can't do any more because now that you're looking at it, this side of the city is actually historic, and you can't build in the historic district. So, some of this stuff is some of the research findings here are pretty high level, and they certainly don't provide as intense or innovative or new as a mechanism. I think some of the other research conducted here about what we can do about the problem. I think this research shows some of what we already know and a little bit of what we don't, which is what is the problem.